As we close this chapter, it becomes painfully clear that the story of the Moore family doesn't end here. The discovery, the arrest, and the shattered silence of a community were only the beginning. What followed, the trial, the shocking testimonies, and the disturbing revelations of Damien's inner world, would take this tragedy to a level few could have imagined. Part 3 will dive deeper into the courtroom drama, the hidden truths that came to light, and the haunting question that still lingers: could this have been prevented, or was it always destined to happen? Stay with us as we continue the journey in Part 3 of this heartbreaking story. Make sure to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share this video so you don't miss the next installment of The Killer Next Door. Something significant. The dog's attention was broken. The handler, distracted by the commotion, pulled the leash and redirected the animal. The critical moment slipped away. Damien forced himself to keep moving, his face a blank slate, but inside, he was trembling violently. His quick, deceitful thinking had bought him a little more time, but it had done nothing to erase the ever-present danger. That evening, the house sagged under the collective weight of its grief. Neighbors dropped off casseroles that would go uneaten, lit candles on the porch that did little to push back the darkness, and whispered promises of prayers that felt increasingly hollow. Regina leaned against Lydia, her voice now hoarse and broken. Terence paced the rooms like a caged predator, slamming his fist against a wall in a burst of impotent rage. And Damien sat apart, quiet and isolated, the truth of what lay buried in the woods pressing down on him far more heavily than the soil that covered his brother's body. This forces another difficult question upon us. If you were in that house, surrounded by that palpable grief, would you have noticed the older son's unnatural stillness? Would you have trusted the nagging instinct that something was profoundly wrong with his demeanor, or would you have told yourself that grief manifests in strange and unpredictable ways, and that people should not be judged in their darkest hours? Comment below. Because sometimes the most devastating truth is standing right in front of us, and we, out of love or denial, refuse to see it until it is too late. By July 3, 2024, the investigation's methodology began its imperceptible but critical shift. Detectives were on the block before sunrise, their knocks on doors now accompanied by more pointed questions that probed specific timelines and minute details. They re-interviewed neighbors, focusing on those who were out late watering lawns, the woman who walked her dog at 10 p.m., the mail carrier who knew every porch and hedgerow by heart. They visited Caleb's school again, speaking with teachers and parents who could only recall his vibrant smile, not any useful clues. They collected and reviewed countless hours of footage from traffic cameras, doorbell cams, and security systems at nearby businesses, a monotonous sea of grainy clips showing passing headlights, blurred figures, and shadows that never resolved into a missing child. The answer to the question on everyone's lips, "Where did he go?" remained a frustrating, echoing nowhere. Detectives scheduled another formal interview with the Moore family, sitting at Regina's kitchen table while a fan pushed warm air across their notepads. They walked her through the night of the 28th for what felt like the 100th time. And it was here, in this setting, that she mentioned it almost as an afterthought, a trivial detail that seemed insignificant amidst the catastrophe. Damien was cleaning the floor when she got home. He said he spilled something. He never cleans. She said it softly, almost apologetically, as if she were wasting their time with domestic trivia. The two detectives, however, did not blink. They wrote it down, and the fact was underlined. Experienced investigators know that teenagers do not, without extreme duress, voluntarily scrub carpets at midnight. That single, offhand sentence shifted the entire investigation's center of gravity. From that moment, Damien Moore was no longer just the missing boy's brother, he was a person of interest. They began to observe him the way mechanics listen for a faint knock in a complex engine, quietly, intently, waiting for the rhythm to reveal the flaw. They noted how he stood during organized searches, present but never engaged, his eyes scanning the faces of the searchers rather than the ground. They analyzed his prior interview answers, noting how they were clipped, rehearsed, and devoid of the emotional spillage that characterizes genuine grief. When asked to recount his activities, he clung to a thin, brittle script. "I was in my room. I didn't hear anything." The more they asked, the less he added. True grief is messy, contradictory, and rambling. His testimony was clean, simple, and utterly static. This leads to another pivotal question for parents. If you were in Regina's position, would you have volunteered that detail about the late-night cleaning? Or would you, out of a subconscious desire to protect your child or a fear of what it might mean, have kept it to yourself? Share your answer below, because this is the terrible dilemma at the heart of so many familial tragedies. A small, domestic detail is the blaring siren, and our love for our children often compels us to hit the mute button. The detectives requested a forensic sweep of the home. In mid-July, a quiet, efficient team entered with alternative light sources, chemical reagents, and swabs. On the surface, the kitchen and hallway looked normal. Freshly wiped counters, a mopped floor that shone under the light. But forensic science does not care about surfaces, it seeks the truth that lies beneath. Under the glow of a blue light, faint, telltale spatters, invisible to the naked eye, showed up near a kitchen baseboard. A reagent, misted across the area, produced a faint luminescent reaction along the edge where the wall met the floor, a pattern inconsistent with a spilled beverage. Swabs were taken and sealed into evidence envelopes. There were no cheers, no announcements of a breakthrough. They simply noted the patterns, bagged the evidence, and moved on. The hallway rug was next. Most of it showed nothing, but one corner, where the fibers met the backing, lit up under the forensic lamp. Just enough to indicate that someone had tried, and failed, to erase more than just a simple mess. When the results trickled back from the lab, they confirmed the detectives' mounting suspicions: human blood. Not a vast quantity, but a presence. A story. A story that had survived a frantic mopping with bleach and water. A story that was now telling its quiet, undeniable truth. A detective returned to Regina with measured, non-accusatory questions. "Walk me through that night again. You said you checked on your younger son? Did you touch him, or did you only look?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow. It forced her to realize she had never laid a hand on him, had never felt the warmth of his skin or the rise and fall of his chest. She had only seen a shape beneath the covers, and her own fear had written the ending, assuring her that the shape was her sleeping child. A wave of guilt and horror washed over her so profound she could only cover her face and whisper, "I only peeked. I just closed the door." It wasn't a confession to a crime, but it was a devastating admission that assumption and fear had overruled a mother's most basic instinct. With the forensic evidence now pointing unequivocally to a violent event inside the house, the circle around Damien tightened into a vice. They brought him in for another interview, asking him directly why he had been cleaning so vigorously the night his brother vanished. "I spilled something," he insisted, his foot beginning a nervous tap under the table. "What did you spill?" "Juice." "What kind of juice?" "Grape." The problem with a flimsy lie is that it tears at the slightest tension. They asked which rag he used, where he put it, when he rinsed it. He stumbled over the details. He changed the order of events. He asked why it mattered, his voice rising in pitch. Sweat gathered at his hairline despite the cool temperature of the interview room. It wasn't a full confession, but it was the first significant crack in his facade, and the trained professionals on the other side of the table saw it clearly. His behavior outside of the interrogation room was also telling. He hovered near doorways when the forensic team was working, as if his mere presence could somehow outstare the science. An officer later noted in his report that Damien visibly flinched when a technician mentioned the word baseboard, a tiny, involuntary tick that spoke volumes. The investigation was no longer a search for a missing child, it was now a methodical construction of a homicide case. They built it piece by piece, like a bridge made of steel facts, until it could hold the weight of the truth. They recanvassed the neighborhood, now asking about late-night digging sounds, backyard lights flicking on at odd hours, anything out of the ordinary. The neighbor remembered Damien with the spade days before Caleb vanished. The canvas was tightening. By late July, the investigative team had a working theory they could state aloud behind closed doors. Caleb Moore had not left that house alive on his own volition. Something catastrophic had happened inside, and his older brother knew everything about it. They did not arrest him yet. They moved with deliberate caution, knowing that moving too quickly could shatter a fragile case. Instead, they gathered contradictions. They lined his statements up side by side, highlighting the inconsistencies. They spoke to his teachers about his temperament, to his former friends about his state of mind. The pressure was building brick by brick, and something else shifted, something Regina felt in the changing tone of the questions. They were no longer about a wandering child. They were about cleaning agents, the chemical composition of bleach, and the transfer of fibers. She sat on the edge of her bed one afternoon, staring at her hands, and remembered how she had thanked her son for cleaning up a mess she never saw. She wished, with a pain that felt physical, that she had asked one more question, turned on one more light, placed one hand on one small shoulder to feel the living warmth of her son. The house had tried to keep its secret. The fresh mopping, the open windows, the hurried wipe along a baseboard. But science has a relentless way of finding what panic leaves behind. And while the community continued to search outward, the investigation had turned completely inward, slowly closing the space around the one person whose story never grew, never flexed, and never matched the damning evidence being coaxed from the very floors and walls of his home. The truth was buried, but not nearly deep enough. August 5, 2024. The interview room door latched with a definitive click. The camera on the wall blinked a steady red light. Damien Moore sat in a cold, metal chair, the hard surface making every small shift sound unnaturally loud. He tried to affect an air of nonchalance, one ankle resting on his opposite knee, but the constant, tight rubbing of his thumb against the seam of his jeans betrayed his profound anxiety. Across from him, two detectives set down a digital recorder and a thick, well-organized folder. They began simply, almost gently, lulling him into a rhythm. What did you do Friday night? What did you watch on TV? What time did your mom come home? Where was your brother the last time you saw him? Damien answered in short, rehearsed lines. I was in my room. I didn't hear him. I don't remember. He kept his chin raised in a show of defiance, but his eyes continually slid toward that folder, sensing the weight of what it contained. One detective asked him to tell the story from the beginning again, without skipping anything. I was in my room, then I went to the bathroom, then I went back to my room. The detective wrote a single note, and then let the silence expand, stretch, and become oppressive until it scraped against the walls. Calm can hold for a long time, but it only takes one detail to shatter it. The folder was opened. Photographs were slid across the cold table. Images of the kitchen baseboard under alternate light, showing a scatter of faint specks. Photos of the hallway carpet fibers, glowing where a reagent had been applied. Aerial shots of the property, with tool marks near the back fence circled in white. A satellite image with a second, darker patch of earth 300 meters away, marked with a glaring red pin. These are from your house, the detective stated calmly. And this is a spot down the path. Help us understand what we're looking at. Damien's heel began to tap, a nervous piston under the table. I spilled juice. Juice does not test positive for blood, Damien. Juice does not transfer to carpet backing in that pattern. Juice does not make shovel marks like these. A printed timeline was placed next to the photos, his previous statements placed side by side. In one version, he was in his room when his mother arrived. In another, he was washing a spill. In a third, he went straight to bed. The contradictions were laid bare. They began to circle again, their questions tightening like precision wrenches. What did you clean with? Where is the rag you used? What color shirt were you wearing that night? He said bleach. Then changed it to just hot water, then claimed he didn't really clean at all. He said the rag went in the washing machine, then the trash, then he couldn't remember. He said a gray shirt, then a white one. The detectives never raised their voices, they simply applied more pressure, turning each inconsistency into a lever to pry open the truth. An hour in, both his feet were flat on the floor. 2 hours in, his shoulders slumped and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly. The recorder captured every shaky breath, every hesitation. Paper cups of water left condensation rings on the table like tiny, evaporating timelines. Finally, a detective slid the last sheet of paper forward. It summarized the presumptive blood evidence, the tool impressions, the K9's interest, and the map coordinate of the second site. We are past maybe, Damien, he said, his voice low and firm. Where is Caleb? Damien stared at the edge of the table, his resolve crumbling. I want to go home. We all want you to be able to do that, but we need the truth first. He looked at the photos, at the maps, at the cold, hard facts that had dismantled his fragile story. His voice dropped to a broken whisper. If I tell you, can I see my mom? The detective was careful. Let's do this in the right order. Damien's eyes went to the recorder's blinking light, then down to his own trembling hands. I did it, he whispered. I stabbed him. I buried him twice. The room went utterly still. Say it again clearly. I stabbed him. I killed Caleb. I buried him in the yard and then I moved him. The questions that followed were calm, methodical, and devastatingly detailed. He was asked to start at the moment before. He described Caleb on the rug with the little blue car, asking to play. He described walking to the kitchen, the feel of the cold knife handle. He described almost sitting down on the floor to play, then not. He described the first thrust and the way Caleb's mouth formed the word why. He said the subsequent motions felt like a machine had taken control of his arms. He described yanking the bedspread, wrapping the body clumsily, and dragging the weight down the hall. He spoke of the resistant earth, the shallow first grave, and his whispered words, "No one will find you." He confessed to the panic that made him return on July 1st, the sound of the bedspread snagging, the fear of the headlights, and the exhausting effort of digging a second, deeper grave under the trees. The detectives read the full, horrific statement back to him, line by agonizing line. He signed each page. There were no tears, no dramatic outbursts. If there was any remorse, it was hidden behind the exhausted, blank face of a 17-year-old boy who had convinced himself that extinguishing his brother's light would somehow make his own shine brighter for his parents. On August 6th, under guard and with a magistrate present, Damien was taken for a scene reconstruction. He pointed without emotion to the drawer that held the knife, the rectangle of rug where the attack began, the scuff in the hall where the bundle had bunched up, and the back door latch he'd used. Outside, he led them to the fence, demonstrating how he'd used the spade. He then walked them down the footpath to the second site under the trees. Forensic teams photographed, flagged, and collected the evidence: the knife, the spade, and the race car bedspread from storage, its stains dull but unmistakable. Each item clicked into place, another irrefutable link in the chain of evidence his confession had begun. Neighbors watched from a distance as the somber procession moved from house to yard to woods. Regina could not bring herself to watch. Terence stood on the sidewalk, his arms rigid, his jaw set, staring at the boy he'd once taught to hold a wrench as if he were gazing at a stranger from a nightmare. Now, hearing that cold, mechanical confession and watching that emotionless walkthrough, we are left with a final, unsettling question. Did you hear remorse for Caleb in his words, or simply a fear of the consequences once the photographic evidence was laid bare on the table? Share your thoughts in the comments, because how you answer that question fundamentally shapes your perception of every event that led to this point, and everything that would follow. In the days following Damien's confession, investigators enlisted forensic psychologists to piece together the why, to understand the internal mechanics that could drive a 17-year-old to commit such an act against his own sibling. The explanation, while not excusing the crime, provided a devastating clarity. The core of Damien's pathology was an identity built upon being an only child. For the first 9 years of his life, he was the sole focus of his mother's attention, a attention that was already strained but undivided. The arrival of Caleb didn't just introduce a sibling, it shattered the world Damien believed was his alone. This wasn't simple jealousy, it was a pathological fixation. He had convinced himself, over years of perceived slights and reinforced by his father's contrasting treatment, that his mother's love had been stolen. He could not let go of this wound, he picked at it until it festered into an obsession. The experts pointed to the warning signs as classic markers. His command to his mother years earlier, "Don't you ever have another one," was not a childish plea but an early indicator of this obsessive thinking. Over time, every hug Caleb received, every smile he elicited from Regina, was not seen as a natural expression of love but as a deliberate act of theft against Damien. Psychologists drew parallels to rare but documented cases of sibling-directed violence, where deep rivalry twists into a resentment that finds no healthy outlet. For most children, the adjustment, while difficult, is managed. In a perfect storm of personality, parental dynamics, and neglect, that jealousy can calcify into something dangerous. Damien didn't just dislike his brother, he built a comprehensive narrative in which Caleb was the antagonist in his life story, the obstacle to his happiness, and the sole reason for his profound unhappiness. Experts explain that in such cases, the child is trapped in a torturous conflict, seeing the sibling as both family and enemy. A conflict that creates a psychological storm most parents cannot fathom existing within their own home. Aunt Lydia, in a tearful interview, articulated this dichotomy perfectly. He hated Caleb, but he loved him too, she sobbed. That's what makes it all so unbearable. I saw him play with him, laugh with him 1 minute, and then glare at him the next like he was a rival. It was like watching a war he was fighting inside himself every single day. The motive, at its center, was not material gain or rage at the world. It was the chillingly simplistic and yet infinitely complex desire to be the only one, the sole recipient of a love he felt had been stolen from him. When he couldn't reclaim it through any other means, he chose to annihilate the person he believed had taken it. This forces a reflection upon all of us. Have you ever witnessed a jealousy between siblings that seemed to simmer beyond normal rivalry into something darker? Did you recognize it for what it was and address it, or did you, perhaps, convince yourself it was a harmless phase they would outgrow? Share your experiences below, because the line between love and hate within families can sometimes be terrifyingly thin, and in this case, that line was crossed with the most deadly of consequences. August 12, 2024. The courtroom was a stark, formal place that felt entirely separate from the world of children, yet on this day, everyone's attention was fixed on one, Damien Moore. He shuffled in, wearing an ill-fitting juvenile detention jumpsuit, shackled at his wrists and ankles. His head was bowed, not in apparent shame, but in a stubborn refusal to engage with the proceedings or meet the stares of the packed gallery. For weeks, the community had whispered about the trial, and now they filled the benches, seeking answers that the law could provide, though no legal outcome could ever return Caleb to his mother's arms. The judge began by reminding the court that the defendant was 17 years old. Under United States law, this placed him firmly in the category of a child in conflict with the law. This designation carried specific legal implications: no death penalty, no life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The options were constrained by statutes designed to recognize the ongoing neurological development of adolescents. The possibilities were: 1. Detention in a secure juvenile facility until his 21st birthday. 2. Possibility of extended supervision and mandated psychological treatment upon release. A murmur rippled through the gallery. To many, 4 years of detention felt like a grotesquely inadequate response to the premeditated murder of a child. The prosecution did not dwell on the emotional horror of the crime. Instead, they built a meticulous, clinical case for premeditation. The knife was not grabbed in a blind rage, it was selected from a drawer. The bedspread was not a random choice, it was a tool for concealment. The first grave demonstrated intent to hide, and the second grave, dug days later, demonstrated cold, calculated reasoning to evade detection. Every detail shows planning, the lead prosecutor stated, her voice sharp and clear. Every action shows awareness. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was murder. Damien stared blankly at the table before him, but a faint flicker in his eyes when a photo of the spade was displayed did not go unnoticed. The defense, in its turn, painted a portrait of a neglected child, a boy raised in the emotional shadow of a distant father and an overwhelmed mother. They spoke of the jealousy that took root at age 9 and was left to grow unchecked. They highlighted the warnings he gave that were laughed off as sulking. They called upon psychologists who testified about the documented phenomenon of sibling-focused fixation and how it can warp a child's perception of love and survival. Damien Moore is not a monster, his defense attorney argued evenly. He is a profoundly broken boy who was drowning in a pain that no one helped him navigate. Their plea was for rehabilitation within the juvenile justice system, for treatment, not merely punishment. The family sat in the courtroom, a study in divided grief. Regina looked hollowed out, her eyes red and empty, clutching a tissue she no longer used. Terence sat rigidly at the far end of the bench, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed it might shatter, his gaze a mixture of fury and utter disbelief. Aunt Lydia wept openly throughout. By September, the hearings delved deeper. The prosecution hammered on the second burial as the ultimate proof of cold-blooded calculation. The defense countered with school records, teacher testimonials, and expert opinions on adolescent brain development, arguing that his ability to judge consequences was not that of an adult. The community outside the courtroom was fiercely divided. Some believed the juvenile sentence was an insult to Caleb's memory. Others argued that the law existed for a reason, and that children, even those who commit heinous acts, must be treated as children. Finally, on October 22, the sentence was read. The judge, after reviewing the vast and conflicting testimonies, imposed the maximum allowable under juvenile law: detention in a secure juvenile facility until his 21st birthday, to be followed by mandatory, intensive psychological treatment and strict, extended community supervision. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed in the silent room. The reaction was a mix of stifled gasps, angry murmurs, and resigned nods. Regina collapsed into her sister's arms, whispering that she had now lost both of her sons, one to violence and the other to the system. Terence remained standing, his fists clenched, a portrait of unexpressed rage. Damien sat motionless, the only sign of life a faint tightening of his jaw. Two brothers. one family. A home shattered by a choice that can never be undone. Damien Moore will spend his formative years behind locked doors, but the question of what happens when those doors eventually open remains. Was justice truly served for Caleb Moore? Or was a profound tragedy merely delayed? Now it is your turn to weigh in. This is a case that challenges our concepts of justice, redemption, and parental responsibility. Do you believe Damien should have been tried as an adult and spent his life behind bars? Or does he, as a product of a failed environment, deserve a chance at redemption through the juvenile system? Drop your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and join this difficult conversation. And if you want to explore more stories that force us to confront the darkest corners of love, betrayal, and the pursuit of justice, make sure you like this video, share it with others, subscribe to The Killer Next Door, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Because these are not just cases, they are warnings, they are lessons, and sometimes, they are the most disturbing mirrors held up to our own society.